Chapter 14, Personality. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at 4 different perspectives on personality, starting with the psychodynamic, which we're going to talk about in this video. Then we're going to move on to humanistic perspective, trait and biological perspectives, social cognitive theories, and then finally we're going to look at how personality is assessed, different techniques for doing that. So again, this video is going to be part 1 and part 2, what is personality, and then we're going to look at Freud's psychoanalytic theory. First, what is personality? Personality is what makes you you, right? So we can have similar behaviors, whatnot, but your personality is what makes you distinctive. So personality is distinctive, a distinctive and relatively enduring ways of thinking, feeling, and acting that characterize a person's response to situations. Personality has 3 characteristics. First, personality is part of your identity, right? It distinguishes you from others. Personality is caused primarily by internal factors, not the environment. And then personality is very organized, and we're going to look into what that means a little later. But a person's behavior fits together. It has meaning, so it suggests that there's an inner personality that guides and directs our behavior. In figure 14.1 of your texts, it shows perceived characteristics of behaviors that are seen as reflecting an individual's personality. Right? So you've got personality there, and you've got components of identity, perceived internal cause, and perceived organization and structure attributed to personality. The psychodynamic perspective. This is the first of 4 that we're going to look at. You're all very likely familiar with Freud's work. So psychodynamic theorists, they look for causes of behavior in an interplay of inner forces that often conflict with each other, right? So the determinants of behavior are unconscious, and the unconscious mind has a powerful influence on behavior. So when Freud was off studying and there were the patients, they were having physical symptoms, but there was no physical cause that they could find, Freud reasoned that the unconscious mind was manifesting these physical symptoms, therefore demonstrating the powerful control that it has. Now, you're not able to see the unconscious mind, so Freud came up with at least 3 methods of accessing the conscious mind. One was hypnosis, which everyone's aware of. One is free association, which is when Freud or a clinician will say one word and you say the first word that comes to your mind. And then the third way of accessing the unconscious mind was through dream analysis. Freud saw personality as an energy system. Okay? So psychic energy is generated by instinctual drives that we have, and these drives are discharged either directly or indirectly, and we're going to get to that. Mental events, we have a consciousness, like a conscious, which we're aware of. We have the preconscious, which contains memories, thoughts, feelings, things we're unaware of but can be recalled. And then we have the unconscious. These are wishes, impulses, and etc. We are unaware of them. In the text, it described them as a dynamic realm that lies beyond our awareness. So again, here's the structure of personality according to Freud. You've got the conscious, which is like the tip of the iceberg, right above the water there, because you can see them, immediate awareness of the current environment. You have the preconscious, which is just under the water. It's available to awareness, so as you can have these memories or feelings triggered, right? They're accessible. And then you have the unconscious, which are unavailable to awareness, right? It says infantile memories, repressed wishes, and conflicts. So we're completely unaware of these things. You'll see here also that we're getting into the ego, the superego, and the id, which is the next portion of Freud's personality theory. So the superego and the ego, they bounce around across everything, and the three levels of consciousness. But the id exists here in the unconscious. So we are not aware of this powerful mental force that drives us through drives and instincts and whatnot. So here we'll get a little bit more into it. So the id exists totally within the unconscious mind, in the innermost core of our personality. So when we're born, we only have the id, and it's the source of all psychic energy. It has no contact with reality, functions, whatnot. So it exists completely inside of us with no access to the outside world. As we get a little older, the ego develops, and it functions primarily at the conscious level. And it functions to keep impulses of the id in control. So it delays gratification, imparts self-control, and it operates according to the reality principle. So it tests reality to decide when and under what conditions the id can safely discharge its impulses and satisfy its needs. Okay, so you've got the id here, who's totally selfish and driven for pleasure and all sorts of things, and it wants to eat right now, bam, bam. Then you've got the ego, who's going to be realistic about it and say on when the id could eat, when it can satisfy in a more controlled, acceptable way. And next, you've got the superego, which develops after the ego. So it's the last one to develop, and it's usually by the age of 4 or 5. It's the moral arm of the personality. So it holds all the values and ideals of society. So it controls impulses of the id with external control and tries to block gratification permanently. So moralistic goals take precedence over realistic goals, regardless of the personal cost, right? So you've got the id saying, I want to do that right now. That's the one in the center that just wants pleasure no matter what. You've got the ego that's going, oh, well, maybe we can well, I guess I should have jumped over here. Then you've got the superego, which says it's not right to do that. It's like over the top moralistic, right? And then you've got the ego in the middle saying maybe we can compromise. So the ego gets information from both the id, who crazily wants to just satisfy itself, and then the superego, who's over the top moralistic, and then you've got the ego in the center that tries to sort of reason with both and balance the input of both. So what happens when the ego can't control the id? Okay, the id is, freaking out, wanting its pleasure, wanting its whatnot, and the ego just can't control it. Then you end up with anxiety. Ego cannot control the id equals conflict, anxiety when impulses of the id threaten to get out of control. Okay, so the ego is really struggling with this id that's fighting and wanting something, and anxiety is the result. So then we have defense mechanisms. The defense mechanism, it's a weapon of the ego, right? Distortions of reality operate unconsciously, and they cause maladaptive behavior. There's a chart on the next slide where we're going to look at some of these. So the ego asserts these defense mechanisms to protect. Repression is when the ego uses its energy to prevent anxiety arousing memories, feelings, and impulses from entering consciousness. So repression is just when the ego tucks the information or tucks the feeling or memory way, way down deep so that it doesn't enter the consciousness. So here are some of the defense mechanism strategies. Okay, we're not going to read all of them. but we'll look at the first one at least. Rationalization. So the definition of that is using excuses to explain away threatening circumstances. So an example of that is I did poorly on the test because the questions were so tricky. So you're rationalizing. You're making excuses for why you did poorly on the test. Go down a little bit. Repression, keeping unacceptable thoughts or traumatic events buried in the unconscious because you don't want to deal with them, right? Your ego is like not wanting to deal with it. So a person who was raped cannot recall the event at all. Any horrible memory or thoughts or feelings that you do not want to deal with or experience, you can repress. Your ego would repress those feelings so that you do not have to experience them, that pain, right? Okay, let's look at sublimation. Transforming unacceptable thoughts or needs into acceptable actions. So a person may turn to boxing to deal with aggression. All right, so next we're going to look at Freud's psychosexual stages of development. Let me just see here. So Freud's psychosexual development theory, basically he believed that personality is molded by experiences that you have in the first years of your life. So children, like starting right from birth, they pass through a series of psychosexual stages in which the id's pleasure-seeking tendency are focused on specific pleasure-sensitive areas of the body, or erogenous zones. So in the oral stage, which is birth to 2 years old, they derive pleasure from oral stimulation, tasting, sucking, whatnot. And if the baby, child, either has too little oral stimulation or too much oral stimulation, problems that can exist later in life include dependency, aggression, problems with drinking, smoking, eating, nail biting, all things to do with the mouth. Anal stage, 15 months to 3 years, so primarily focused on controlling the bladder and bowels, eliminating retaining feces. So, if they are not successful in this, or too successful, problems, fixation include like anal, expulsive, messy, wasteful, destructive, anal retentive. Oh, I see. Anal retentive being orderly, rigid, obsessive personality type. We'll just do one more and you can read the rest. Phallic stage, which is ages 3 to 6, they are primarily focused on their genitals, the differences between males and females. And then this, of course, if you've seen Oedipus, this is where the child becomes a rival for the affection of the opposite sex parents, Oedipus complex. Children begins to identify with the same sex parents. Okay, so in Oedipus, if any of you have seen that, it's when the child grows up and identifies with the father, falls in love with the mother, ends up killing his father and wanting to marry his mother. Anyways, too much of that, or not enough, can result in sexual deviancies or confused sexual identity. Freud believes that girls continue to possess feelings of envy or inferiority because of penis envy. All right, so you can read latency and genital because I think you get the idea. So with any of these stages, they can either not get the satisfaction, which means they're not having enough, or too much, and they get stuck there. And then these are the problems that result of that. The research on psychoanalytic theory, Psychosexual stages were rejected um, pretty quickly and by most. Um, and it was criticized for having too much, putting too much of the importance of early experiences and emotional attachment um, as how personality was developed. There's very little there's little current research to assess psychoanalytic theory. Part of the problem is that the concepts are ambiguous and they're difficult to operationally define and measure. In order to do research on anything, you need to be able to operationalize, like have definitions for things. And his concepts were just too vague. The research on free association, defense mechanisms, and repression continues to this day, but there's not a lot of research yet. But people are still doing research on those things. There is also a growing body of research about non-conscious processing of information. So much of our moment-to-moment mental and emotional life does occur outside of our conscious awareness. So there is continuing research into that, just not the idea of how childhood sexuality shapes personality. That part was dropped. Freud's legacy, neo-analytic and objects relations approaches. So, like everything else, Freud's ideas about the id and the ego and repressed sexual drives, that part was dropped, but new ideas did come from his theories, right? There's always something that comes and people take it over and move forward with it. So, neo-analytic approaches, those are the people that Freud worked with, did research with. They liked some of his ideas, so they took those ideas and moved forward with those. So, psychoanalysts who disagreed with certain aspects of Freud's theory, so they started developing their own theories. One issue was that they didn't think that Freud considered social and cultural factors. And again, he stressed infantile sexuality too much. So Erikson argued that personality development continues across a lifetime instead of Freud saying that it was really formed within the first, what was that? A lot of it within the first 10 years, right? So Erikson has his stages, which we did talk about in another chapter, and how that continues across a lifetime. Adler is another neo-analytic psychologist, and he states humans are not motivated by sexual instincts. Instead, they are inherently social beings and motivated by social interest. Okay, so the desire to advance the welfare of others. One of his terms that he came up with was striving for superiority, motive to compensate for real imagined defects in themselves and become more competent. So, what he's saying is that we have an inherent desire to improve ourselves. Carl Jung, another analytic psychologist, he expanded Freud's notions of the unconscious to include a collective conscious, which is memories of the entire human race, sort of a collective memory. There's not a lot of that in this textbook. It was just touched on. If you're interested to find out more about Carl Jung, you'd have to dive deeper. But a lot of the new analytics came up with object relations, which is carrying forward, an important concept to know about. So that focuses on mental representations that people form of themselves and of other people as a result of early experience with caregivers. Attachment theory, which is a very big theory both in psychology and social work, anything to do with child development. It grew from object relations theory, which was from chapter 12. And today, psychodynamic theorists draw more from object relations concept rather than classic analytic theory. So objects relations, that's hard to say. Object relations theory or object relation concept, that whole, read into that a little bit more because you'll see that come up in further chapters and come up to anything to do with developmental psychology as well. We already did this a little bit, but just to touch on this last little section of the textbook, evaluating psychoanalytic theory, not held up under scrutiny of research. Again, difficult to test, not just because the concepts are vague, but also because of the circular reasoning, right? So something can be a defense mechanism or it can be a reaction formation. If it's not a defense mechanism, it's the other. So it's always something, okay? So it's difficult to make behavioral predictions, which is the point of doing the research. Focus on unconscious processes driven by forbidden desires and impulses. Current research now it does still focus on unconscious processes, but it focuses more from a cognitive processing and perception perspective. So again, the psychodynamic perspective has made very big contributions into the study of personality. It's just taken off from where Freud had it into more current views and left some of his concepts behind. The next section we'll be looking at is the humanistic perspective in the next video.